The day I turned 74, a young woman at the farmer's market asked me how I stayed so kind after living such a long life. I smiled, handed her a slice of pie, and said nothing. Because how do you explain to a stranger that your life began with a nightmare and somehow you're still here? How do you tell someone that your own brother stole your childhood and your father tried to bury the truth beneath silence? My name is Christine Johnston. I live in New Hope, Pennsylvania, a quiet town where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. I've spent most of my adult life hiding what happened to me in that old creaking house on Sycamore Lane. But I'm too old to be afraid now. And maybe, just maybe, my story will help someone else find the strength to speak before it's too late. I wasn't always this calm. I wasn't always the sweet old lady with the lilac scarf and lemon pies. I used to be the girl who whispered in corners, who flinched at loud voices, who thought shame was something she had to carry like a second skin. That shame began when I was just 13. I was born in 1951, the second child of Margaret and Howard Johnston. My brother, Brian, was older by 3 years, and to everyone in town, he was perfect. Blonde hair neatly combed, A's on every report card, captain of the Little League team. My parents beamed when people praised him, and they often compared me to him quietly, sometimes not so quietly. You should try to be more like Brian, my father would say with a sigh whenever I did something he didn't approve of, like spending too much time reading or forgetting to iron a shirt. I used to think Brian was my protector. When I was little, he held my hand when we crossed the street. He scared away the boys who teased me at school. I adored him. But something changed the summer before I turned 13. Brian had just turned 16, and he'd grown taller, stronger, quieter. He started looking at me differently, not like a brother should. And his moods began to shift like the weather sweet one moment, distant the next, and sometimes something else I didn't have words for back then, something cold, something calculating. That summer, Mom was sick a lot. She spent most of her days in bed, battling migraines and waves of nausea that no doctor seemed to understand. Dad worked long hours at the paper mill and came home smelling like smoke and silence. It was just Brian and me most afternoons, wandering between the garden and the porch, pretending everything was normal. The first time he touched me in a way that made my skin crawl, I thought it was an accident. I froze. I didn't know how to move, how to breathe. When I pulled away, he just smiled like it was a joke, like I was overreacting. I didn't tell anyone. Who would have believed me Brian was the golden boy? I was the shy girl with skinned knees and too many questions. Besides, Mom was too sick, and Dad, well, Dad didn't like weakness. If you cried, he called you soft. If you asked for help, he made you regret it. So I kept it in. Weeks passed, then months, and the things Brian did became worse. Each time, I told myself I'd speak up. I'd find the courage. But fear has a way of curling around your throat until silence becomes a survival skill. I started locking my door at night. I stopped smiling. My grades dropped. Teachers asked if something was wrong, and I shook my head. Mrs. Elaine Foster, our neighbor, tried to chat with me a few times on her porch. "You look tired, sweetheart," she'd say. "Everything all right at home?" And I'd nod. Always nodding. By the time I turned 14, I'd lost count of the nights I cried into my pillow. And then came the day my body betrayed me, when I realized I hadn't had a period in 2 months. At first, I thought it was stress. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew. I knew what was growing inside me. I knew who had put it there. I was 14 years old. I was pregnant, and the father was my own brother. But the worst part, that wasn't the end of the nightmare. That was only the beginning. After that realization, after I knew I was carrying my brother's child, I didn't sleep through the night for weeks. I would wake up gasping, heart pounding, soaked in sweat, as if my body was screaming for a way out. But there was none. At 14, you don't have the language for trauma. You just feel like you're unraveling inside. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, lifting my shirt and staring at my belly. It didn't look like much yet, but to me, it was already screaming. Every small change in my body, every wave of nausea, every ache in my back felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. I tried to hide it the best I could. I wore my baggiest sweaters, even in the warm Pennsylvania spring. I skipped gym class. I started walking with a slump, trying to make myself invisible. But shame is hard to hide. It seeps through your skin and into your eyes, and people notice even if they don't know why. Mom didn't say much. She was still weak most days, often confined to bed with a damp cloth across her forehead. If she noticed I was different, she didn't let on. Maybe she assumed it was just teenage growing pains. Or maybe deep down she didn't want to ask. I think part of her had learned long ago how to look away when things became too hard. Dad, on the other hand, was distant but observant. He wasn't the kind of man who offered affection, but he noticed when things were out of place. One evening at dinner, I could feel his eyes on me while I picked at my food. I hadn't touched the roast chicken, and I'd gagged just smelling it. "You sick or something?" He grunted. "No, sir," I whispered, staring at my plate. "Then eat. Don't waste your mother's cooking." I shoved a forkful in my mouth and chewed until my eyes watered, forcing it down even as my stomach flipped. I didn't dare run to the bathroom. That would have made things worse. Brian, of course, sat across from me cool as ever. He watched me too, but not like Dad did. His eyes were different, colder, controlling. Every once in a while, he'd kick my foot under the table, just hard enough to make me jump. Then he'd smirk and keep chewing like nothing happened. At night, I locked my door with a chair propped against the knob. Some nights, he tried anyway. I'd hear the soft twist of the knob, the quiet pressure against the frame. But the chair held, and I'd lie there, hands clutched to my chest, too terrified to breathe. I kept telling myself I just had to make it until school let out. Then I'd figure something out. Maybe I'd run away. Maybe I'd tell someone, Mrs. Foster, maybe, or Pastor Wallace. But the closer I got to the end of the school year, the more my belly grew, and the less I believed I had options. And then came the day everything fell apart. I was in the kitchen folding laundry, one of my daily chores, when Mom came in behind me, looking more alert than usual. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. "Christine," she said quietly, "turn around." I froze. I turned, clutching the towel in my hand like a shield. She was staring at my stomach. "Take off that sweatshirt," she said, barely above a whisper. I shook my head. Her voice turned firm, almost angry. "Take it off." With trembling hands, I pulled it over my head. Underneath, I had on an old, stretched-out t-shirt. It clung to me in a way that left no doubt. My belly still small, but undeniable was right there, plain as day. For a moment, Mom didn't move. Her hands dropped to her sides, and her mouth opened slightly, like she was trying to speak, but had forgotten how. "You're pregnant?" she whispered. I didn't answer. Who is it? Christine. Her voice rose slightly, trembling. Who did this to you? I just stood there, eyes filling with tears. Tell me. And finally, I did. I whispered his name. Brian. She recoiled like I'd slapped her. No, she gasped, stumbling back. No, that's not possible. But it was. And she knew it. She backed into the wall, slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her face in her hands. I knelt next to her, reaching out, desperate for her to say something, anything. We have to tell Dad, I finally said. She looked up, her face pale as snow. No, what you don't understand. Christine, he'll kill you, or him, or both. You don't know what your father is capable of. I did, though. I'd seen enough over the years. Broken dishes, bruises on Mom's arms she never explained, the rage simmering beneath his silence. Still, I didn't expect what came next. Later that night, when Dad got home, Mom told him. She didn't tell him the truth, not exactly. She said I was pregnant, but she didn't say by whom. His face darkened. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would crack. You little tramp, he growled. I warned you what would happen if you ever brought shame to this house. Then he backhanded me across the face so hard I fell to the kitchen floor. And Brian, he stood in the hallway, just far enough to be out of reach, watching. He said nothing, not even a fake protest. That was the night I realized something terrible. My father was never going to protect me. He was going to bury the truth to protect the family name. And my mother. She was too broken to stop him. I was alone, and I was carrying the child of my own brother. The days after my father found out were the worst of my life. I thought the abuse from Brian was the bottom, the absolute end of what I could bear. But I was wrong. What came after being treated like filth by the man who was supposed to protect me? Being blamed for what had been done to me cut even deeper. The morning after he hit me, I woke up with a swollen cheek and a ringing in my ear. My mother didn't come to check on me. Brian had gone about his usual routine off to school, whistling like nothing had changed. And my father, he stayed home that day, not to help, not to comfort, but to make plans. He came into my room around lunchtime, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face like stone. You won't be going back to school, he said flatly. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. You'll stay in this house, out of sight, until the baby comes. After that, we'll say it was a stillbirth and send it off where it belongs. Dad, my voice cracked. Please. He stepped forward, and I instinctively shrank back. I don't want to hear a word, not one more damn word from you. You did this. You'll live with it. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Because what could I say? I hadn't done this. It had been done to me. But in this house, the truth didn't matter. Only control did. Only silence. From that day on, I was a ghost in my own home. My father nailed the windows in my room shut. He removed the lock from my door so he could check in on me whenever he pleased. I wasn't allowed to go outside, not even to sit on the porch. My mother left food at my door like I was an animal, and Brian never looked me in the eye. Weeks passed, then months. My body changed quickly. I could feel the baby growing, my belly stretching, my skin pulling tight, the ache in my back growing worse by the day. I was a child carrying a child, and I had no one to hold my hand through it. I talked to the walls at night just to hear a voice. Sometimes I imagined running away, sneaking out while everyone slept. But where would I go? I had no money, no one I trusted. And I couldn't bear the idea of being pregnant and homeless, or worse, caught and dragged back. My father had made it clear if I stepped out of line again, I wouldn't survive the next time. There were days I thought about ending it all, taking a handful of pills, disappearing into the bathtub, slipping into silence. But every time the thought came, I'd press my hands to my stomach and feel the tiny flutter inside me. A reminder that this life inside me, however it got there, was innocent. It wasn't the baby's fault. I hated Brian. I hated my father. I hated that my mother had let it happen. But I didn't hate the child. And that was the cruelest twist of all. Around my 7th month, something changed. My mother began sitting on the edge of my bed for a few minutes each night. She never said much. Sometimes, she'd just look at my belly and shake her head. One night, I asked her quietly, "Did Dad ever hurt you?" She didn't answer at first, but then, with her eyes fixed on the floor, she whispered, "He wasn't always this cruel, but he's always cared more about what people think than who we are." That was the closest thing to comfort I ever got from her. Then came the night the labor started. It was early, just over 8 months, and I woke up in a sweat, feeling like something inside me had shifted. Pain bloomed in my lower back and spread through my legs like fire. I cried out, and for once, someone came. My mother rushed in first, pale and trembling. "It's happening," I gasped. "I think it's happening." She didn't call an ambulance. Instead, she called a woman named Mrs. Carter, a retired nurse who lived on the edge of town and owed my father a favor from years back. Within the hour, she was there, stern-faced and quiet, carrying a bag of supplies like she'd done this in secret before. My father stood in the doorway with arms folded, watching as if he were overseeing a business transaction. "Make sure it's over quick," he said to the nurse. "No noise. We don't want the neighbors asking questions." "Mrs." Carter shut the door in his face. What followed was 12 hours of agony. I screamed into a pillow. I bit my arm so hard it bled. I begged for it to stop, but eventually, just before dawn, I heard a cry, a thin, desperate cry, and everything blurred. The baby was a boy. Mrs. Carter handed him to me for just a moment. He was so small, pink skin, tuft of dark hair, eyes squeezed shut, lips puckering. I wept, holding him against my chest. My heart split wide open. For one brief moment, I felt human again. Then my father came in. "Give him here," he barked. "No," I whispered, clinging to him. "Please." He didn't listen. He tore the baby from my arms and handed him to Mrs. Carter. "Take him to that home outside Allentown, the one that doesn't ask questions. Tell them he was abandoned." She hesitated. "She just gave birth." "Howard, you could at least do it," he snapped, "or I'll find someone who will." And just like that, he was gone. My baby, my boy. I never even got to name him. Afterward, I lay in bed for days, refusing to eat. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house, the sound of life moving on without me. My mother didn't come. Brian disappeared for hours at a time, and my father pretended like nothing had ever happened. But something inside me broke for good that week, not just because I lost my child, but because I realized something deeper. I wasn't a daughter in that house. I was property, a mistake to be covered up. And unless I found a way out, I would die that way. I don't remember much about the weeks after they took my baby, just the cold. It wasn't winter, not yet, but I felt frozen all the time, like my body had shut down in protest, as if it no longer belonged to me, my breasts ached, trying to feed a child who wasn't there. My stomach sagged with emptiness. And my mind, it wandered in and out of something close to madness. I remember lying there, day after day, curtains drawn, the smell of stale soup lingering in the room. My mother brought food and left without a word. My father didn't come at all. And Brian had vanished. Not literally. He still lived there, but it was like he knew I was too broken to fight anymore. Or maybe he was just waiting for the dust to settle, so he could start again. But I wasn't going to let that happen. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror across the room. I was pale, gaunt, with shadows under my eyes and hair falling out in clumps. I didn't recognize the girl looking back at me, and for the first time in months, a single, powerful thought cut through the fog. I don't want to die here. That night, I waited until the house was silent. I crept to the bedroom window and tested the frame. The nails were still there, rusted but firm. My father had sealed them after the day he found me trying to sneak out months earlier. I'd been caught then, dragged back inside, locked in the basement for 2 days with nothing but water. But this time, I had a new idea. I turned to the floorboard near the closet. It had always been loose, just enough for me to hide little things when I was younger. I pulled it up slowly and retrieved the tiny screwdriver I'd hidden weeks earlier. I'd stolen it from Dad's toolbox while he was napping in front of the TV. It took nearly an hour of slow, careful work, prying each nail out with shaking hands, pausing every time the house creaked. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure someone would hear it, but no one came. When the last nail gave way, I opened the window and let the night air wash over me. It smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke. Freedom. I climbed out and dropped to the grass below, wincing as my bare feet hit the ground. I didn't have a plan, just one name in my head, Mrs. Elaine Foster. She was the only adult who had ever truly looked at me, seen the sadness behind my eyes, and tried, in her own quiet way, to reach me. I stayed low, slipping through the side yard and across the street, moving like a shadow. Mrs. Foster lived 3 blocks away, in a little brick house with white shutters and wind chimes on the porch. When I reached her front steps, I collapsed in a heap and sobbed. It was nearly midnight. She opened the door in a bathrobe, her hair in rollers, holding a flashlight. She gasped when she saw me. "Christine," she whispered, kneeling down. What on earth? I couldn't speak. I just reached for her hand like a child, begging not to be left behind. She helped me inside, sat me down on her couch, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. For a long time, she didn't ask anything, just brought me tea and let me breathe. Eventually, she said, "Honey, what happened to you?" And I told her, not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough that her hands trembled when she reached for the phone. "I'm calling Pastor Wallace," she said. "He'll know what to do." I nodded, but we never got that far. The door burst open before she could finish dialing. It was my father. How he knew I'd gone there, I'll never know. Maybe he saw the open window. Maybe Brian had noticed. Maybe it was just his instinct, honed from years of control. But there he was towering, furious, red-faced. "Get away from her," he barked. Mrs. Foster stood between us. "Howard, she's not leaving with you. You have no right to keep my daughter. I have every right to protect a child in danger. She's my child," he growled. "You want to see danger? Keep testing me." I watched from the couch, shaking. My legs wouldn't move. I was so close to safety, but still caught in his storm. And then he struck her, a backhand across the face that sent her reeling into the wall. I screamed. That scream must have been louder than anything I'd ever let out, because lights came on across the street. A neighbor appeared in the doorway, and for once, finally someone called the police. My father turned back to me, his face twisted. You think this changes anything? I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew it did. Within minutes, the sirens came, red and blue lights flashing in Mrs. Foster's cozy living room. Officers pulled my father outside. Mrs. Foster, her lip bleeding, insisted on pressing charges, and me, I was taken to the hospital. The doctors asked questions I couldn't answer without crying. A counselor sat with me for hours. I told them everything about Brian, about the baby, about the bruises that never healed. For the first time, I was believed. The next morning, I was placed into emergency custody with a temporary foster family. They were kind, quiet, let me sleep, let me cry. I spent weeks just trying to feel like a person again. But healing isn't a straight line. I missed my baby. I had nightmares of him crying in some stranger's arms, wondering why I never came. I hated Brian. I hated what he took from me. But I hated myself more for not escaping sooner. It wasn't fair. None of it. But I wasn't giving up. One day, I asked the social worker, "Can I ever get my son back?" She looked at me, long and hard. "That will be a long road. Christine, but if you're willing to fight, we'll help you." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something stir in me again. Hope. The weeks that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. I was safe, yes. No more creaking floorboards outside my bedroom. No more fear of footsteps in the hallway. But the silence brought its own kind of pain, the kind that echoed. Every moment alone reminded me of the baby I'd lost. Every sunrise without him was a wound that refused to close. The foster family I stayed with, the Thompsons, were kind in that reserved, respectful way. They gave me space, but never left me completely alone. Mrs. Thompson made blueberry pancakes every Sunday and placed a small vase of fresh daisies on the windowsill near my bed. She didn't ask about my past, not until I was ready. And when I finally did speak haltingly, tearfully, like someone learning to breathe again, she listened with a soft strength I hadn't known mothers could have. A caseworker named Allison came to see me every few days. She had sharp eyes but a gentle voice, and she never pushed harder than I could handle. One afternoon, as we sat across from each other on the back porch, I finally asked her what I'd been dreading. "My son," I said. "The baby, the one they took. Is there any way I could find him?" Allison looked down at her clipboard, then back at me. "Christine," she said carefully, "I won't lie to you. It's going to be hard. You were a minor, and because the adoption happened through unofficial channels, the paperwork might be buried or even falsified." My heart sank. "But," she added, "we're not giving up. We've already filed a request to investigate the home where he was reportedly dropped off. We're also contacting Mrs. Carter, the nurse who delivered the baby. If she remembers anything, that could help." I nodded slowly. "Thank you." That night, I dreamed of holding him again. I didn't even know what his name was. What if they hadn't named him at all? What if he grew up thinking he was unwanted when all I ever wanted was to love him over the next few months? I stayed in therapy and went back to school part-time. I was still just 14, but I felt 1,000 years older than the other girls in the room. They talked about dances and makeup and boys. I sat quietly, pretending I belonged, but feeling like an outsider to a world I used to live in. Sometimes, I'd catch my reflection in a hallway window and barely recognize the girl staring back. One day, Mrs. Foster came to visit. Her lip had healed, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. "I'm so proud of you," she told me, wrapping her arms around me. "You did the bravest thing a person can do. You told the truth." I clung to her like I was still that girl on her porch, desperate for someone to believe me. "You saved my life," I whispered. "You saved your own." "Christine, I just opened the door." A few weeks later, Allison returned with an update. We located the adoption home near Allentown. Unfortunately, their records were lost in a flood. At least that's what they claim. But Mrs. Carter gave us a lead. She remembers a nurse named Veronica who might have been present when the baby was handed off. We're tracking her down now. That sliver of hope was all I needed. I began journaling every night, writing to my son, letters he might never read. Things like, "I held you for only a minute, but I remember your cry. They never gave you a name, but in my heart, I called you Samuel. One day, I hope you'll know the truth, not the shameful silence they buried us under." As I wrote, something inside me began to shift. The grief didn't leave, but it became a companion instead of a prison. And in that space, I started to grow. I joined a support group for girls who had survived abuse. At first, I just listened. But then, one evening, I shared. I spoke of Brian, of the night my father hit me, of the baby I lost. And when I looked up, no one turned away. No one judged. They cried with me. That was the first time I realized I wasn't alone. Allison called again in late fall with a new update. "We found Veronica," she said. "She remembers a baby boy handed off under suspicious circumstances around the time you gave birth. No paperwork, no name, but she recalls the couple who took him." My breath caught in my throat. "They were older," she continued, "maybe in their late 40s at the time, couldn't have children of their own, lived in Lancaster. They may have changed the boy's name, but they were decent people. That's what Veronica remembered most. They were kind." I sobbed, unable to speak. "There's more," Allison added gently. "We think we found him." My whole body went cold. You found him. We're not certain yet. But there's a young man, his name is Michael now, who matches the profile. He's 17, and he's been asking questions about his birth." My knees buckled. I dropped the phone. When I picked it up, I could barely whisper, "Can I meet him?" Allison's voice was soft. "We'll need to go through the legal process. He's a minor until next year, but he's asked to meet his birth mother, if she's willing." I pressed the phone to my heart and cried. I was willing. More than anything in the world, I was willing. The day I was set to meet my son, I woke up before dawn. I stood at the window of the Thompsons' guest room, watching the fog roll through New Hope like a slow tide. My hands trembled as I reached for the dress I'd laid out the night before, just a soft cotton blue one, simple and clean. I wanted to look calm, stable, but inside, I was anything but. 17 years. That's how long it had been since I'd held him for those brief seconds after birth, since they'd taken him from my arms before I could even whisper his name. And now, all these years later, we were about to meet face to face. Allison picked me up around 9. We drove in silence for much of the way, the trees on either side of the road bursting with the colors of early October amber, rust, deep red. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, afraid that if I moved too suddenly, the whole thing would vanish like a dream. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to say, Allison said gently. And if you feel overwhelmed, we'll take a break. This isn't about fixing everything in one meeting. It's just about starting. I nodded. Has he seen a picture of me? She glanced over. Yes, he said you look kind. I blinked back tears. I don't feel kind. Not for what I let happen. Not for giving him up. You didn't give him up, she said softly. They took him from you, and he knows that now. We arrived at a small community center just outside of Lancaster. They had reserved a private room with 2 chairs, a table, and a box of tissues already placed between them. Through the small window in the door, I saw a tall young man pacing nervously, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, his head down. Michael. He was lean, with dark hair like mine, and a tension in his shoulders that reminded me of all the nights I curled into myself on the cold floorboards of my childhood room. I wanted to run to him, to hug him, but I stood frozen. Allison put a hand on my back. You're ready. I stepped in. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, we stared at each other like 2 people trying to piece together a memory we never shared. Hi, he said quietly. Hi. I breathed. Michael. He nodded. Yeah, but they said you used to call me something else. Samuel. I whispered. I only held you for a minute, but that name, it came to me like it was yours before you were born. He smiled faintly. I like it. We sat. There was a long silence. Neither of us knew where to start. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and guarded pain, like he wasn't sure whether to trust the hope blooming inside him. I'm sorry, I said at last, my voice shaking. I didn't want to leave you. I didn't want any of what happened. I know, he said. They told me. The adoption agency, once I started asking questions, they told me it was complicated, that it wasn't your choice. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I was 14. They never gave me a chance. I fought, but not loud enough. I wish I had screamed louder, run sooner, anything to keep you. Michael looked down at his hands. I used to think about her all the time, my birth mother. I imagined she was someone who just didn't want me. I used to get so angry, especially when I turned 13. I'd look in the mirror and wonder what part of me reminded you of someone you wanted to forget. My eyes welled up. You reminded me of the only part of my life that felt pure. I didn't forget you, Michael. I thought about you every single day. I wrote you letters I never sent. I prayed you'd grow up happy, safe. He was quiet for a moment. I was safe. My adoptive parents, they're good people. Strict, but good. But I always felt different, like something was missing. We sat together, letting that truth settle in the space between us. Do you want to know what happened? I asked carefully. To me. To why I was pregnant in the first place, he didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. I think I need to. And so I told him. Not everything. Not in detail, but enough. Enough for him to know he wasn't the result of love, but also not the result of my failure. I explained that I was abused by someone I had trusted, that my father had hidden it, that I was locked away, that his birth was the only light I'd had in that darkness. I don't want you to carry my pain, I said. I just want you to know it was never yours to bear. He looked at me with eyes that were suddenly older than his 17 years. Thank you for telling me, for not hiding. He leaned forward, hesitated, and then wrapped his arms around me. I held him for the second time in my life, And this time, I didn't let go. After that first meeting, Michael and I didn't try to rush anything. We met again a week later, this time at a park in Lancaster. Just the two of us, sitting on a weathered bench under the shade of a maple tree. He brought pictures of his childhood, his adoptive parents, his dog, Jasper. He told me about his love for music, his plans for college, and his curiosity about where he came from. And I listened, fully, without fear, without shame. Just a mother catching up on 17 lost years, one small piece at a time. There were no promises, no dramatic reunions, no declarations of everything's okay now, because it wasn't. But it was something real, something growing. When I returned to New Hope, I felt different, stronger, not healed, not yet, but steadier. And with that strength came a quiet conviction I couldn't ignore anymore. I knew I wasn't the only girl who had been silenced, not the only one who had been hurt and hidden. And for all the people who had turned away from me when I was a child, there had also been people like Mrs. Foster, like Allison, who had stood up when I couldn't. I wanted to be that person for someone else. So I walked into the town hall one rainy Thursday morning and asked about volunteer opportunities for survivors of abuse. They referred me to a nearby women's shelter, small, underfunded, but run by passionate women who welcomed me with open arms. I started with small tasks, sorting donated clothes, helping serve meals, but soon found myself sitting in on group sessions. At first, I just listened, but one evening, a teenage girl with bruises on her wrist and terror in her voice said something that knocked the air out of me. "I feel like I don't matter," she whispered, "like I'm already ruined." And before I even realized what I was doing, I reached for her hand and said, "You're not ruined. You're wounded. And wounds heal. I'm living proof." From then on, I began sharing more of my story, not every detail, but enough to open the door for someone else to speak. Enough to make them feel less alone. Word spread. More girls came. A few local women began calling me Miss Christine, and though I smiled at the nickname, it stirred something deep inside. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving just for me. I was surviving for them. Eventually, the shelter asked me to help co-lead a weekly recovery group. I was hesitant at first. I had no degree, no training, but they insisted that my lived experience was a kind of wisdom they couldn't teach in textbooks. One day, after a particularly heavy session, a girl who reminded me so much of myself at 14 lingered after the others left. She looked down at her shoes and said softly, "Do you think I'll ever feel whole again?" I knelt beside her, looked her in the eyes, and said, "You already are. You just haven't been told that enough." Back home, my phone would buzz once or twice a week, Michael sending a photo of his band's rehearsal, or a question about our family tree, or just a simple thinking of you. And I treasured each message like a small miracle. One Saturday, he drove to New Hope and spent the day with me. We walked the trails behind the old Quaker meeting house. I showed him where I used to sit as a child, staring up at the sky, wondering if anyone could see me from heaven. I used to ask God why he forgot about me. I told him. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just waited until you were ready to help the ones he hasn't reached yet." That night, I wrote in my journal just like I had done when I was pregnant and alone and scared. But this time, the entry wasn't for a child I'd lost. It was for the woman I was becoming. You survived hell, Christine, and now you are someone else's shelter, That is not small. That is sacred. It started with a letter. A woman named Carla Maddox, a columnist for the Bucks County Tribune, had attended one of the shelter's open houses where I'd quietly shared a piece of my story. A few days later, she reached out asking to interview me for a feature on women who had turned personal trauma into public service. At first, I hesitated. I didn't do the work for recognition. I wasn't sure I wanted my name or my past printed for the world to see. But Mrs. Foster encouraged me. "Christine," she said, sitting across from me with a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, "you spent decades in silence. Now you have a voice. Don't be afraid to use it." So I said yes. Carla came to my house with a tape recorder, a yellow notepad, and a kindness in her eyes that made it easier than I thought it would be. I told her about my years locked in that house, about the baby they stole from me, and the long, crooked path back to my own name. A week later, the article ran with the title, "From Silence to Shelter, The Strength of Christine Johnston." I didn't expect much, but the calls started coming almost immediately. Local churches reached out, asking if I'd speak at youth groups or women's luncheons. A high school counselor invited me to share my story with a small group of teen girls facing unsafe home situations. Survivors wrote letters, some anonymous, others scrawled with trembling signatures, thanking me for saying out loud what they'd held inside for years. And then, the phone call that changed everything. It was from the district attorney's office in Doylestown. "Ms. Johnston," the voice said, "we read your story in the Tribune, and we believe your case deserves to be reopened." My breath caught. "I know it's been decades," the woman continued, "but in recent years, Pennsylvania law has changed to allow new investigations into historical abuse cases, especially when patterns of concealment or coercion are involved. If you're willing, we'd like to begin that process with you." My first thought was, why now? My second was, why not that week? I sat down with the DA's team and gave a full statement. I provided everything I could: names, dates, the timeline of events. Allison helped pull old hospital records. Mrs. Carter, the nurse who delivered my son, agreed to testify about what she'd witnessed. Even Mrs. Foster stepped forward to recount the night my father burst into her home. Brian still lived in Pennsylvania. He worked for a construction company, had a wife, 2 kids, and by all appearances, a quiet, decent life. But when investigators contacted former classmates and neighbors, stories began to emerge, stories about threats, about strange behavior, about other girls. He'd simply moved on. While I had spent a lifetime piecing myself back together, the grand jury was convened 6 months later. The charges were limited due to the passage of time. Many had expired under the old statute, but 2 counts still stood: child endangerment and unlawful restraint. And while they weren't enough to undo what had been done, they meant something powerful. He was finally being held accountable. The day he was arrested, I stood in my kitchen, the sunlight pouring through the window, my hand shaking around a cup of coffee. Michael called. He had seen the news online. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I'm not doing it for revenge." I told him, "I'm doing it so no one else ever has to carry what I carried in silence." "I know," he said. "And that's exactly why it matters." Later that year, the women's shelter where I volunteered asked if I'd be willing to have my name placed on a new wing they were building. A quiet room for girls who needed a safe space to cry, to speak, or to simply be still. I cried when they showed me the plaque, the Christine Johnston Healing Room for those finding their voice. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't known since childhood. Not victory, not vindication, but peace. As the trial date approached, I found myself waking earlier each morning, not with dread, but with a strange calm I couldn't explain. I still had moments where fear curled in the pit of my stomach, but they no longer ruled me. I had walked through fire, and somehow I had come out on the other side still standing. Michael came to visit the weekend before the hearing. He was taller than I remembered, a little more grown into his shoulders, but his smile, tentative and warm, was the same. We sat on the porch, wrapped in sweaters and surrounded by the soft rustle of October leaves. He brought his guitar and played a song he'd written, a quiet melody he called 17 Winters. "I wrote it for you," he said, glancing at me shyly, "about waiting." Tears welled up in my eyes as the notes hung in the air between us. "I waited too," I whispered. "Every year on your birthday, I baked a cake, even when I didn't know where you were." He looked down, his voice thick. "Can I see one of those journals? The ones you wrote to me." I stood and disappeared into the house, returning with a weathered composition notebook, one of many. I handed it to him like an offering, the cover soft and bent, the ink inside faded, but still legible. He opened it, read a few lines, then closed it and held it to his chest. "Do you ever wonder what might have been?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "But I try not to live there." We didn't talk much after that. We just sat together in the quiet, the kind of silence that holds more love than words ever could. The next day, he helped me pack up a few boxes from the attic. I had decided to downsize, to move into a smaller house closer to the center of town, nearer the shelter and the girls I now mentored. As we sifted through old photo albums and dusty keepsakes, Michael pulled out a folded quilt I hadn't seen in years. It was baby blue, with little clouds sewn into the edges. My mother had made it when she was pregnant with Brian. She'd planned to pass it down through generations, but it had ended up shoved in a forgotten box, along with years of unspoken grief. "Did you ever keep anything of mine?" he asked softly. I hesitated, then reached beneath the floorboards in the corner of the attic, where I had once hidden secret letters and broken hopes. From that space, I pulled out a tiny, hand-stitched cap. It was the only thing I'd been able to keep from the night he was born. Just a pale green knit beanie, smaller than a teacup. I stole it, I admitted, voice cracking. When they weren't looking, I couldn't let them take everything. He took it gently, holding it in his palms like it might fall apart. Then he leaned forward and hugged me harder than he ever had before. "I'm glad you kept it," he whispered. That night, after he left, I sat at the kitchen table and lit a candle, not for sadness, but for remembrance, for the girl I used to be, for the daughter who survived, for the mother who waited, and for the women who still hadn't found their voices yet. The trial began the following week. I won't lie, it wasn't easy. Brian's lawyer tried to downplay everything. My father had died 3 years earlier, taking much of the burden of guilt to the grave. But I testified. I stood in that courtroom, not as a broken girl, but as a woman who had fought her way back. My story didn't just convict a man. It freed a girl who had been locked in silence for far too long. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict came in. Guilty. It didn't bring me joy, not the kind you'd expect from someone who'd waited a lifetime to hear those words. What I felt instead was release, like someone had finally cracked open the sealed box I'd been trapped inside for decades and let the light pour in. After the sentencing, I walked out of that courthouse not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a woman who had reclaimed her voice. And as I stood beneath the soft gray sky of new hope, I realized something I wish I could tell every girl who has ever felt invisible. The silence they force on you is not your burden to carry. It never was. Today, I'm 74 years old. I still wake early and bake pies on Sundays. I still sit with young girls at the shelter and hold their hands when their stories become too heavy. And every now and then, Michael comes to visit. We sit on the porch and talk about music, or we don't talk at all. Sometimes healing sounds like laughter. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone staying. A few months ago, he asked if he could call me Mom. I told him he always could. Even before he knew me, he was part of me and always will be. I don't tell this story because it's easy. I tell it because I know there's someone out there, maybe listening right now, who's been waiting for permission to speak. Maybe it's taken you years to find the words. Maybe you've been told it's too late. But let me tell you something from the deepest part of my being. It's never too late to break your silence. It's never too late to begin again. And it's never too late to come home to yourself. Even if they try to bury your voice beneath shame, beneath fear, beneath years of silence, it's still there, waiting, fierce, brave, yours. I'm not who I was, and I'm not who they said I was. I'm Christine Johnston. I was abused, silenced, forgotten, and still I rose. I rose, and I reached back. And I will keep reaching for every hand that needs to be held, for every girl who thinks no one will believe her, for every woman who's been told she should just forget. You don't have to forget. You just have to live. And you can, I promise. If Christine's story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength or someone you love, please share your thoughts in the comments below. You never know who your voice might help set free. And if you'd like to hear more real stories of resilience, healing, and hope from people just like Christine, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we give them back to the people they belong to. And that includes you.